Imagine a dog who, after years of companionship, finds himself lost and destroyed when his owner, the only person he knew in the world, simply disappears from his life. What happened next left everyone in shock. And if you like animal stories as much as I do, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That way, you won't miss any upcoming stories. John was 73 years old and lived in a simple little house in a quiet neighborhood in the United States. After his wife passed away, he began to feel the weight of loneliness. It was then that he decided to adopt a dog, and so Rocky, a pit bull just a few months old, came into his life. From the first day, it was easy to see that John and Rocky would form an inseparable duo. John's mornings began to take on a new meaning. Every day, very early, he and Rocky would walk in the nearby park. John, with his slow pace, and Rocky, always by his side, keeping pace with his owner. They rarely left each other, whether it was for a walk or to watch TV on the old sofa in the living room. Rocky always stayed close by, as if he understood that John needed him. John, despite his advanced age, did his best to take care of Rocky as if he were his own son. He fed him the best food, bought him toys, and always made sure that his four-legged friend was happy. And in return, Rocky offered him something that no amount of money could buy: companionship and unconditional love. Time passed, and the bond between them only grew stronger. To those who watched from the outside, it seemed that Rocky knew what John was thinking, and John seemed to understand every look the dog made. It was a silent friendship, built on routine and constant presence. On the days when John felt more tired, Rocky would get even closer, lying down next to him, as if he knew that his owner needed a little more affection. But lately, John had been feeling that his body was no longer the same. There were times when he felt weaker, more tired than usual, but he preferred to ignore the signs. He didn't want to worry anyone, least of all Rocky. He knew that his dog depended on him, and that motivated him to keep going, day after day. Rocky, in turn, seemed to notice the changes in John. Although he couldn't speak, he showed his concern by getting even closer. His attentive eyes followed John's every move, as if he was always ready to help, even if he didn't know exactly how. The relationship between the two was something difficult to explain, but easy to feel. They completed each other in a way that only those who have ever loved a pet could understand. Time passed, and John's health began to show more obvious signs of deterioration. He could no longer walk as much as before, and mornings in the park began to be replaced by quick walks around the block. Even so, John tried to maintain the routine, because he knew how much Rocky loved these walks. But the truth is that each step seemed heavier than the last, and this was starting to worry even the neighbors. Rocky also noticed that something was different. When John sat down on the couch to rest, the dog would stand next to him, watching intently. Sometimes, Rocky would lay his head on John's lap, as if he wanted to comfort him in some way. John always smiled when he stroked his faithful companion's head, but deep down, he knew that his strength was no longer the same. The walks became shorter and the days longer. John spent most of his time indoors, sitting or lying down, always with Rocky close by. The dog, who used to run around the yard with all the energy in the world, now seemed to understand that the time for playing was over. All he wanted was to be close to John, as if he knew that his owner needed him more than ever. John, on the other hand, tried not to show concern. Whenever a neighbor asked how he was, he would smile and say that he was fine, that it was just his age. But deep down, he knew something was different. He was starting to feel more tired, even without trying very hard, and although he tried to ignore it, he knew that at some point he would have to face reality. Still, he refused to see a doctor. He didn't want to admit that he was getting older, and he certainly didn't want to worry Rocky. John believed that as long as he was there to take care of his dog, everything would be fine. He couldn't imagine what would happen if he wasn't around anymore to make sure Rocky was taken care of. The nights, which were once peaceful, now became more restless for John. He woke up several times in pain or simply unable to sleep, while Rocky remained alert by the bedside. With each movement John made, the dog would raise his head and look at him, as if silently asking if everything was okay. But John, stubborn, continued to try to hide the truth from everyone, even from himself. It was a normal morning, but something was different. John woke up weaker than usual. He tried to get up, but his legs didn't respond as usual. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of fatigue on his body. Rocky was next to him, as always, with his eyes fixed on his owner. The dog seemed even more agitated that morning, as if he knew something serious was about to happen. John tried to get up again, but this time, his strength really left him. He fell back on the bed, sweating and with his heart racing. At that moment, he realized that he could no longer ignore what was happening. In a desperate gesture, he picked up the phone and called his old friend Steve. John's voice was weak, and Steve, upon hearing his tone, knew immediately that something was very wrong. Within minutes, Steve was at John's house. Upon entering, he found his friend lying down, pale and visibly exhausted. Rocky, always by his side, did not leave John's side, but his behavior was completely alert. Steve approached, trying to calm John, and immediately called an ambulance. While they waited, John, with difficulty, held Steve's hand and made a sincere request, "Take care of Rocky, please, if I don't come back." John's words echoed in the room, and Steve, with tears in his eyes, promised to take care of Rocky, no matter what happened. Rocky, even without understanding the words, felt the heavy atmosphere and did not let go of John's side, not even for a second. The dog seemed to realize the gravity of the situation in an almost human way. When the ambulance arrived, John was quickly taken away, and Rocky tried to follow the car, but Steve held him back. The dog's look was desperate. He didn't understand why his owner was leaving, but he felt that something very serious was happening. Steve took him back inside the house, but Rocky remained agitated, pacing back and forth, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for John to return. At the hospital, the news was not good. The doctors diagnosed that John was in critical condition and there was little that could be done. Even so, he thought about Rocky all the time, worried about his faithful companion's well-being. Meanwhile, Rocky, at home, remained restless, as if he knew that the distance between him and his owner was not just physical. If you got this far, comment "I love animal stories." The next morning arrived bringing a disturbing silence. Steve was at home when the phone rang. He answered it, knowing that the call would bring the news he feared most. On the other end of the line, the nurse informed him, in a soft and gentle voice, that John had passed away that morning. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a weight on his chest. He knew he would have to deal with his own grief and take care of Rocky at the same time. After hanging up the phone, Steve went straight to John's house. When he opened the door, he found Rocky sitting on the porch, his eyes fixed on the door, as if he were still waiting for his owner to return. The dog hadn't eaten and looked sadder than ever. Steve tried to talk to Rocky, but the dog just lay there, his eyes lost and dull. It was as if he already knew that John would not be coming back. Steve tried to cheer Rocky up in every way he could. He offered him his favorite food, toys, and tried to distract him with short walks, but nothing worked. Rocky was not interested in anything other than staying near the door or next to the bed where John usually slept. The void left by John was unbearable for the dog, who could not understand why his owner was no longer there. Little by little, the situation began to become more worrying. Rocky, who had previously been a dog full of energy and vitality, could now barely stand up. He stopped eating and drinking, and his eyes were constantly on the door, as if John might come in at any moment. Steve tried everything, but nothing seemed to work. Rocky's sadness was palpable, and anyone who saw him could tell he was in great pain. The days dragged on, and Rocky's condition only got worse. He no longer responded to Steve's calls or to sounds around him. The dog seemed to be giving in to grief, unable to accept the loss of John. Steve took Rocky to the vet, concerned about the dog's health. At the vet's office, the vet was blunt: Rocky was suffering from deep sadness, and without a quick change, his physical health could deteriorate even further. The diagnosis was a blow to Steve. He knew that Rocky and John had a special bond, but he never imagined that John's absence would have such a devastating impact. Steve returned home with Rocky, more determined than ever to try to help him. But despite all his efforts, Rocky continued to wither. The void that John had left was too great, and Rocky could not cope with it. The following days were dark for Rocky. The dog who had once filled the house with life had now become a shadow of his former self. He spent most of his time lying in the corner of the living room, in the same place where he used to sleep next to John. His food remained untouched, and he only got up to look at the door, waiting for something that he knew deep down would not happen. John's absence was a constant weight in the air. Steve, true to his promise, tried everything he could to help Rocky recover. He took him to the park, offered him new toys, even let him sleep at his house, but nothing seemed to shake Rocky from that state of deep sadness. With each failed attempt, Steve's heart sank more. He knew that Rocky was suffering from a pain that words could not describe. The vet, concerned about Rocky's health, suggested once again that the dog needed emotional stimulation and an environment that made him feel safe. But the truth was that Rocky only felt safe with John, and now, without him, the world seemed an empty and cold place. The only thing left for Rocky was the memory of his owner, and that was not enough to keep him strong. Steve, no longer having options, began to spend more time with Rocky. He would sit on the floor next to the dog and talk about John, hoping that somehow his words would bring some comfort. "John loved you so much, Rocky," Steve would say, his eyes welling up with tears. But the dog just sighed, laying his head on the floor, as if he had already given up. The situation got worse when Rocky started to lose weight rapidly. The vet, no longer having many options, warned Steve that Rocky's emotional state was directly affecting his physical health. The dog was wasting away. Rocky no longer had the strength to leave the house, and his eyes, once full of life, now reflected an emptiness that broke the hearts of everyone around him. With each passing day, it became clearer that Rocky was going down the same path as John. The absence of his owner was an unbearable pain, something he simply could not overcome. Steve, now in a deep dilemma, began to wonder if it would be better for Rocky to rest, rather than continue to suffer. The situation was emotionally devastating, both for Steve and for those who witnessed Rocky's unconditional love for John. In the midst of this anguish, the vet suggested to Steve that it might be time to consider euthanasia. The suggestion fell like a bombshell. Steve knew that John would never want to see Rocky suffer so much. But at the same time, he didn't know if he was ready to make such a difficult decision. He looked at Rocky, lying in the corner, and knew that the dog was no longer the same. The emptiness left by John had consumed everything. Steve stayed up all night, thinking about the vet's suggestion. The idea of having to make this decision for Rocky made him anxious. He knew that John would never want to see the dog suffer so much, but at the same time, he couldn't accept saying goodbye to his friend's faithful companion. Steve looked at Rocky, lying in the same place as always, with tired and sad eyes. It was as if the dog was waiting for the moment when he could finally meet John. With each passing day, Rocky's health worsened. He could no longer get up without effort, and even drinking water seemed a difficult task. Steve tried, once again, to cheer him up with toys and treats, but Rocky didn't react. He remained lying still, as if he were giving up on everything. The scene was heartbreaking, and Steve began to wonder if keeping Rocky alive was really the right thing to do. Deep down, Steve knew that Rocky was waiting for John. The dog hadn't given up because he was sick, but because his heart was broken. He was living in a sadness so deep that his body simply couldn't keep up. It was a pain that Steve could understand, but he didn't know how to heal. The bond between John and Rocky was stronger than he could have imagined, and now he was left to make the hardest decision of his life. Steve went back to the vet, this time with a clearer decision in his mind. He knew he couldn't let Rocky continue to suffer like that. The vet, understanding, explained that euthanasia would be a way to alleviate Rocky's suffering, and that it might be the best thing to do, considering the dog's emotional and physical state. Steve felt a tightness in his chest, but he knew it was the right thing to do. When he got home, Steve sat next to Rocky and gently stroked the dog's head. "You were the best friend John could ever have, you know," he said, his voice breaking. Rocky looked at Steve, his eyes tired, but somehow he seemed to understand what was happening. It was as if he was finally at peace with the idea of being reunited with his owner. Steve scheduled the procedure for the next day, with a heavy heart, but certain that he was doing what was best for Rocky. That night was especially quiet. Steve stayed by Rocky's side the whole time, remembering the good times the dog had shared with John. He knew that the pain of losing Rocky would be great, but nothing compared to the suffering that the dog was going through. When the day finally arrived, Steve felt the weight of the decision like a rock on his shoulders. But when he looked at Rocky, he knew that he was giving him the chance to rest in peace, something that the dog deserved after so much love and loyalty. That morning, the sun shone softly through the windows of John's house, but the air was heavy with the approaching farewell. Steve carefully placed Rocky in the car. The dog no longer had the strength to climb in on his own. During the drive to the vet, Steve kept his hand on Rocky, feeling the warmth of his body for the last time. The streets passed slowly, and Steve's mind was filled with memories of the moments that John and Rocky shared. It was hard to believe that the end was so close. When they arrived at the vet, Steve was greeted with understanding looks. Everyone knew that this was a painful decision, but that, deep down, it was an act of love. Steve helped Rocky out of the car and took him inside, where the atmosphere was calm and quiet. Rocky, despite his weakness, seemed at peace. It was as if he knew he was about to be reunited with his old friend John. Steve stayed by Rocky's side the entire time. He stroked the dog's head, whispering words of affection and gratitude. "You were amazing, Rocky. John would be so proud of you," Steve said, his voice breaking. He could feel the tears welling up, but he tried to stay calm for Rocky, who, with his tired eyes, seemed to understand every word. The vet explained the procedure gently, and Steve just nodded, knowing that this was what was best for Rocky. He held the dog's paw tightly, feeling the weight of goodbye with each passing second. Rocky took a deep breath, and in a final gesture of loyalty, he rested his head in Steve's hands, as if saying goodbye. With a gentle touch, the vet began the procedure. Rocky slowly closed his eyes, and within minutes, he was at peace. Steve couldn't hold back the tears. He stood there, holding Rocky's paw, even after the dog's heart stopped beating. The room was silent, but the love between John and Rocky was still palpable. They would finally be together again. Steve stayed with Rocky for a few more minutes, feeling the emptiness grow in his chest. The loss was immense, but at the same time, there was a sense of relief. Rocky was no longer in pain, and the idea that he could be by John's side again brought Steve a small peace. He knew he had done the right thing, but that didn't make the goodbye any less painful. When Steve left the office, the sky seemed bluer than ever, and for a moment, he imagined that John and Rocky were together, running somewhere, free from any pain. Rocky's absence would be deeply felt, but his love and loyalty would be remembered forever. The days after Rocky's goodbye were silent and full of reflection for Steve. He returned to John's house often, trying to come to terms with the void that both the dog and his owner had left behind. The house, which had once been full of life with Rocky's playfulness and constant presence, now seemed like just a memory of the past. But even with all the sadness, Steve felt an inner peace knowing that Rocky was, in some way, with John. In the weeks that followed, Steve continued his routine, but he always carried with him the memory of John and Rocky. He would return to the park where they used to walk, now just watching the other dogs and owners, remembering how much John loved those simple moments with his four-legged friend. The memories, although painful, also brought a certain comfort. Steve knew that their friendship was special and eternal. Over time, Steve began to think about how he could honor John and Rocky's memory. He decided to adopt another dog, not to replace Rocky, but to continue the legacy of love and companionship he had witnessed for so many years. He went to the local shelter, the same one where John had adopted Rocky years earlier, and found a new friend, a small mutt with sad eyes full of hope. The new dog, whom Steve named Buddy, brought a new light to his life. While Buddy would never replace Rocky, he did bring joy and companionship, and Steve knew that both John and Rocky would be happy to see the love between a man and his dog continue to blossom. The connection between Steve and Buddy grew stronger every day, and he was grateful to have the chance to make new memories while never forgetting the old ones. Sometimes, when Steve walked with Buddy in the park, he would feel John and Rocky's presence beside him. It was as if they were still there, in spirit, watching and smiling. The bond they had, even after death, lived on in the memories and simple gestures of affection that Steve now shared with his new companion. John and Rocky's story would never be forgotten. For Steve, they would always be an example of the unconditional love that a dog can have for its owner, and vice versa. And now, with Buddy by his side, he felt that this cycle of love and loyalty continued, in one way or another. The park, the streets, and even John's house were full of these memories, which now lived not only in Steve's mind, but also in the hearts of everyone who knew their story. As he walked with Buddy on a sunny day, Steve looked up at the sky and smiled. He knew that, wherever they were, John and Rocky were at peace, running together again, as they did every morning in the park. And, somehow, that gave him the certainty that true love never dies, it just changes form, remaining forever in the memory and in the heart. It's so good to have you here. If you love animal stories as much as I do, subscribe so you don't miss the next videos, take advantage and watch our playlist and get as closer to our stories as possible.